Welcome. I'm Tony McCormick, and I work with a little small company of my own called Medical Information Integration, and I've got with me Dr. Sam Bowen. I'm the project manager for OpenEMR's certification attempts to get to ONC Meaningful Use certification, and Sam Bowen is the president of the organization, or what we call the chief cat herder. I brought him here intentionally because the OSCON trainer for doing presentations here at OSCON recommended that we have a clicker to go with our slideshow. So Dr. Bowen is my designated clicker. He'll also be available to answer questions that I can't answer, which there, I hope, will be many of. It's a pretty big and comprehensive project. What we are not going to do is demo OpenEMR. This presentation is not about demonstrating OpenEMR as a software project, but more about the trials and tribulations and joys and successes of attempting to take a very large, established open source project in the EMR in the health industry and try and get it through the Meaningful Use AAR certification criteria, which is a very convoluted process. And I found it to be quite fascinating. We're still in that process, so this is a sort of a story in progress. OpenEMR, just for a little bit of history, is one of the older EMRs in the business. I think it started originally, it was released open source about 9 years ago, in 98. So it's been around for a long time. It's had a very active community for quite a long time. There was a few developers, but keeping it active and using it for a long period of time. Sam joined the project about 5 years ago after, you used it for a while, right?
7 years.
7 years. So Sam's runs an actual urgent care practice in North Carolina and has been using OpenEMR for a long time, and he took over sort of managing the project back 7 years ago, really. Wow. 2005. Okay. Okay. So there's been a lot of activity around it. It had a very strong community on SourceForge. It was fairly focused on sort of self-developed. The project itself was driven by the users intentionally and positively. So the product had a lot of feed into it from physicians who were actually using the product to do development, and so it managed to evolve kind of on its own into a pretty solid EMR. It's got gaps like all projects would have. And we decided when Meaningful Use, even before it was even called Meaningful Use, that we needed to be CCHIT certified as a group in order to be able to take OpenEMR to the next level. The reason that we chose to do that, why don't you go to the next slide? I'm into the real slides now. So we decided that we wanted to do this to meet the 2011 guidelines. And there were a couple of reasons that we wanted to do that. One of the key reasons, as people who are trying to make our living on providing and selling support services to OpenEMR community and to physician practices, is that the Meaningful Use guidelines themselves, even though they were evolving at the time, gave some focus. There are now, at this point, 25 very specific things that criteria you have to meet in order to be certified. And those 25 items gave us, as a community, something to focus on rather than the random development which had happened before, positive, but random, evolution toward a better product. Now we had a specific list of things that we all agreed were in fact meaningful, that they were things that no matter what happened to the product, if any percentage of those Meaningful Use items made it to the product, then that was going to be good for the whole community, and that none of them were limited to US-only use. And OpenEMR has a pretty wide worldwide acceptance across the board. So that gave us a good focus for items to attack, which you don't get very often in an open source project. You get a lot of customer enhancement requests, but you don't have a really focused directed sort of goal. So the other thing that was very positive is that as a result of that, in order to pass certification, you have to pass a certain level of tests, which means NIST provided a series of scripts, what they call scripts, which are essentially user tests that say things like you must be able to enter a patient, they have to put in this patient with this address, with this name, and if you pass the tests, then you can pass certification. Having essentially a QA plan in advance for an open source project, that's something you don't get very often either. So we thought that was a meaningful way to start the process. Next slide. So the team. What we had to work with was the community that was already there, which was vibrant. We had our open source medical software board, which Dr. Bowen had created in order to have a sort of a guiding force. And all we do really, we meet every 3 or 6 months approximately, and sort of make sure that we're all still headed in the right direction, and that as a community that we have at least a reasonably similar vision for where we're going. And this vision this year has been meaningful use. And then we had a team of OpenEMR support vendors like my company and like Sam's side business. I don't know how he managed to run a full practice, urgent care practice and a side business, but he does. And several other of the original and current contributors in the community were also open source vendors who make their living customizing, supporting, and deploying OpenEMR in the field. And so they were there. And then we had some hired contractors, which we brought on board, and I'll get to that in a moment. And a few industry advisors who were doctors and people like Fred Trotter out there who had some opinions about how an open source project ought to be able to get to certification and what the hurdles might be, and very, very, very useful people to have on our field. And then Sam, the driving force and cat herder in the process. So a couple of things happened there. One of the things that we decided that needed to be done early on, go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm way ahead of schedule, aren't I? I step back a little bit. I have a very few number of slides, and what I want to do mostly in this is sort of give the general picture and then open the floor up for a lot of talk, a lot of Q&A. So this is more a dialogue, intended to be a dialogue with you guys. So when I get to the end here, I hope to have plenty of time to talk about the real challenges. So I'm going to kind of swing through the issues that we faced and the direction we went, and then talk with you guys a lot. And that's the real purpose of this. So we decided, I come from a lot of years of big company industry process, and so of course I jumped right into a nice little cathedral model. And we hired some contractors. Dr. Bowen raised a couple $100,000, and as a method for kick-starting the project, we hired some contractors that were interested in the project across the board. Most of them were all intending to get into OpenEMR support in some fashion or another, and so we're willing to be paid to work for us to do that, myself included in that list. And we started to we then put together a formal project management plan. I did some research and decided that using Sprint was an appropriate methodology. We had a worldwide team. We had developers in India and across the US that were involved in this process. And so I modified the sprint process to be, instead of a daily sprint, a kind of a weekly sprint. And we would set up 2-week sprint runs, and everybody would report their estimated hours and their actual hours and be assigned targets. And we followed that process as we decided on that process and began to follow that process down the road. In the meantime, our advocates like Dr. Brody and like Fred Trotter ran up to the various big meetings where the government and the various entities were attempting to make new rules that would potentially prevent open source projects from actually being able to get certified. And they put their foot in the door really fast and really hard, and I think successfully got some really legitimate changes made at those levels that allowed us to take a big sigh of relief and say, yes, there's actually a real chance that we could get this done and we could actually be certified, that we aren't going to be blocked by proprietary things. And some of those things were stuff that wouldn't be obvious to people who are not open source developers. Things like certification is by version number. That works really well in a proprietary cathedral development model where you're releasing, testing, certifying a project, but in an open source project, that can be problematic considering that code could change every day. And so there were lots of discussions about how that model didn't really fit very well with open source and with open source development, and why that was a bad thing, and why the way we were doing it was a good thing, and indeed wouldn't necessarily break the model of being certified. And I think some of the ability to certify by module and to do self-certification on a given site came out of those lobbying efforts, and without that, we would have been in some serious hurt, I think. So big hand goes out to the people doing the work that's not coding and doing the talking, being the talking heads out there with the government. That's a really important process. We also had Dr. Brody out there who was essentially reading all the thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of arcane preliminary rules and interpreting for us and trying to make some educated guesses about exactly what the rules were really going to boil down to, and what was likely to actually stay on the list and what was likely to be thrown off the list because it was already being questioned. And so without that kind of support in the project, we would have also been basically doing a lot of work that was unnecessary, and so we had a lot of good support there. So then we got cranking on the code. Our developers started pounding away on the various items, and we put up a wiki site to track it, and that's been very active. So each one of the projects, there's a little barometer on the wiki site. In the first slide, there are URLs to that sort of keeps track of each one of the 25 items we chose to work on and what their status was, whether they were unclaimed or whether they were being coded or whether they had been coded and were waiting for QA or had passed our initial look, not certification scripting, but at least our initial testing to prove that it was okay. And so code cranked along. So that's the beginning in the cathedral model. So next slide. So then we've got into the bazaar model. Not the bazaar you were thinking of, I'll bet. But it did get a little bizarre. As it turns out, the cathedral model works really great until you run out of money. And as soon as you run out of money and you're not hiring programmers who will report their time and take projects and deliver them on some predefined schedule, of course, it doesn't work anymore. So you end up with the community, back to being in the community model. So we still, at this point, manage the product, even though we are no longer paying very many programmers. The result of having hired a bunch of people up front and getting it started built a lot of enthusiasm in the community and brought a bunch of volunteer developers into the community because the project became an active project, very active. In fact, we went to number 37 on SourceForge in the activity level 1 week, which was like crazy. And we're floating at, 185, 190 right now as of active projects on SourceForge. So it's still a very, very active community. And the sort of infusion of initial capital to get it started helped bring in a lot of people who were interested in continuing to contribute to the project or to begin to contribute to the project. And though some of the delivery schedules from our hoped-for predicted delivery, which we hoped would be March, and it's now July, have slowed down, the enthusiasm for the project has not slowed at all. We have a very enthusiastic group of new developers and new small companies that are contributing things. In fact, it's gotten so, we've gotten so much support now that there is an enormous number of people who are contributing code or wanting to contribute code in areas that are overlapping. And so the management of that project has gotten to be increasingly more complicated. So that's kind of the middle of the project. Part of that that activity, of course, we struggled with the we struggle with managing the overlapping, and are struggling with managing the overlapping code situation, because we have a lot of people who want to make improvements, and everybody has their idea what those improvements ought to be. So there's an enormous amount of coordination involved in just the code snippets. And these issues aren't uncommon to major SourceForge and open source projects. But they're complicated by the fact that we have a very specific list of things that we have to accomplish that have very specific goals. And so, and a limited number of committers. Fortunately, because of the enthusiasm, the number of people who have been given permission to commit into the project has increased double, at least, since we started. Originally, there were probably five committers, and of which 2 were really active, and 3 had gone off, and now we're up to 7 people who are allowed, who have full commit privileges on the project. Originally, we discovered the SourceForge project is currently running on CVS, which is a sort of a technical issue, and CVS has got some limitations in terms of how it's configured on the system, and so we had to make some changes to the project to allow for branching, for instance, and then because Sam and I, as the project leads, wanted the contributing developers to be able to contribute code that we could see without having to wait for it to be contributed to SourceForge through a intense commit project. We set up a separate source repository on SVN and started using that as sort of a playground for people to test. And that worked to some extent and helped alleviate some of the early thing. But we did settle in pretty quickly to a model that allowed us to submit patches. And then very recently, we moved the project to being, we're going to move the whole project base over to a Git-based development environment. In the meantime, Git provided the ability to synchronize with CVS. And so we created public GitHub environments that are synchronized automatically from the CVS master tree until such a time as we can convert the CVS master tree over to Git entirely. So a lot of improvements in terms of the work activity and the development went in because the enthusiasm and the commitment, and it's kind of an interesting effect, because we got enough, we really desperately needed help. We started getting help, and then we desperately needed to upgrade our infrastructure in order to support the new help we were getting. So it's a pretty common problem, but interesting to solve in an open source environment that's rolling and with a very strong target for completion. Next slide. So the end. I say that with a question mark because we aren't there yet. But from a predictive point of view, we're about 80 or 90% done with the code needed to meet meaningful use certification. And I mean just the code at this point. There's still plenty of effort that needs to be involved in integration work and in QA work. And then we have a pretty cool advantage, which also is a disadvantage at the same time. We have one of our committers, Brady Miller, right? Yeah. I kind of think of him as the enforcer. He is the best code review guy I have ever seen. He will not let anything get into the code base that's remotely outside of the published standards and some unpublished standards. But he's really good about reviewing code. He doesn't just block it. He actually really carefully reviews the code and kicks it back if there's a problem. And so that's a little hard on the new developers who are really anxious and really enthusiastic to submit new code, and then they get really stepped on pretty hard, not in a mean way, but there's like they put in a new piece of code and they're like, this is great, and then they get the review back and every line is trashed because they didn't know that they needed to wrap everything up so that it could be internationalized, and there's lots of little details in a project. This project has 500,000 lines of code, so it's no little project, and it's got a lot of complexity, and so there's a lot of hidden things. No matter how much we try and document it on the wiki in terms of the standards, there's a lot of things that are in people's heads that have been working on it for a long time. And the good thing is that when we run across those kinds of issues and somebody says, hey, I couldn't find any documentation on that, then we try very hard to make sure that gets out on the wiki so that the documentation continuously improves for the developers. So where we're at right now is we've got about 80 or 90% of the coding done. We've got a bunch of the bigger pieces of the code that are the hard stuff, drug-drug interaction interface, lab interface, e-prescribing interfaces, and patient portal. Those are the 4 big ones that are sort of left to clean up the pieces. All the code has been sort of developed. It needs to be tested, integrated. The extra interesting piece of that is that 3 of those require interfacing with outside sources who are also in and of themselves not hostile to open source, but not familiar with how that works. And so they have business models that essentially require you to be a company who is contracting with LabCorp to do a back-end engine server interface. We are not a company, we're an open source project. And so that gets to be a little tricky to pull that off. And so we've been sort of swimming those waters for a while now, trying to figure out how to do that. And what we end up doing is companies that are OpenEMR support vendors essentially end up sponsoring the interface itself, and then we have to decide what to do with what we've paid for and our contracts that we've made directly with these proprietary vendors like LabCorp. The other pieces that are complicated in that are, for instance, the drug-drug interaction and drug allergy, drug-food interaction activities, which are require a contract with a complex database vendor like Lexicomp or First USA Databank, and there's 4 or 5 others that are in that category. While there's a lot of talk of using RxNorm to help with that, RxNorm isn't really ready for prime time in that and is always behind the curve a little bit. And so the e-prescribing companies like SureScript won't really let you use the free databases and be able to pass certification. You have to use a proprietary database. Well, proprietary databases cost money and are, well, proprietary. So that's an odd conflict to have to work through in an open source project, and we've been struggling with that a little bit. Fortunately, Sam desperately needed LabCorp and drug-drug interfaces in his own facility, so he's been facilitating that also through his practice, so that we can at least get past the development of it and then deal with how do we deal with that kind of data and provide the mechanisms by which that we can be certified, whether we have to make part of that certification that the individual doctors have to license databases appropriately. We still feel that even if that were the case, we're so far under the cost of ownership from a proprietary system that it's not too big a hurt. So where we're left then is to get finished, do an interim release, which we're beginning to do a major cleanup project on the current 4.0 release so that we can get ready to do an interim release and kind of lock down some of the feature set that's there and get the rest of it and get it nicely tested and documented. And then begin to get people to start going through the NIST scripts and do a preliminary pass on that so that we can make sure that we think that we can pass certification. Subsequent to that, and then we also need to raise money. Certification is not free. Certification costs $35,000 to get certified. At least it did with CCHIT. If we have other certifying bodies which are coming down the pipe, and if people know about them and what their pricing might be, that would be worthwhile information for us to know. But if you're going to be certified by the CCHIT organization, then you need $35,000 to hand them to start that process. To do that, the open source project has to raise some money in order to be able to do it. There's ongoing costs that also relate to that, in that there's recertification that has to happen on an ongoing basis, and there's management of certified products. So this is a bit left over from the proprietary world. The certification process there has some reporting guidelines in which you have to report who is using certified versions of your software in that process, and Fred can talk about that, I'm sure, at length. And so that means that the organization has to figure out, it's a nonprofit organization, and we have to figure out how do we get to the point where we have some stable income in order to be able to provide those services to manage that certification so that our potential user base out there can actually use the product as a certified product. And those are interesting things for an open source nonprofit organization to have to deal with going forward. And we're faced with them very soon now. We've discussed in the board a lot of different models for that, and I won't go into the details on that yet, but we're open for suggestions in that category on the fundraising. So that's the basic story. If you can go to the next slide. So this gigantic pile of tangled up stuff is a pretty good example of the kind of stuff that you get out of the government. This is what they call a URL. I didn't take the step of putting those in through tiny URL to make them pretty, because I like the fact that they represent the kind of data that we have to deal with and plow through in the government in general. It was kind of representative to me. But these are the key places where the information that we're having to drive this project come from. And, of course, our contact information. The slides are up on the website, both on my website and on the OSCON project website. So, with that, we are now into the question and answer session.
Question, the 35K, is that per bounce against the wall, or is that you get as many bounces as you need to penetrate, repair things? In other words, if you fail the certification, you pay 35K.
Let me give Sam the mic, because he's going to be the driver, and since I got to do the speech, he gets to answer all the questions. Tricky, huh? Let me turn you off a minute.
It's like an open book test, and they try to help you through. And it's not like they're really harsh. If you fail, yes, if you go back to certify again, you have to pay another $35,000. But they're not. It's not like if you miss one little comma that they're not going to make a big seizure over it. So there is some play there to actually try to get the certification done. And
there's a time frame. Once you start with certification through CCHID, you have a certain amount of time. If you don't pass all the tests within that time frame, then that was your.
That's my understanding.
You work with.
But you have a pretty good idea if you're truthful that you're going to make it through, or you're going to.
Yeah, I mean they give you a lot of resources to do preliminary testing, so you know where you stand prior to the test.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, can you hear these guys okay for the film? Okay, so you need to repeat that information so that
There, at least the CCHIT organization has a time frame during which you're trying to complete the certification, and there's actually a little bit of time there where you can actually correct minor errors as you go along. If it's something really major that it doesn't look like you're going to be able to get it done, you'll lose your $35,000. Hopefully anybody who's willing to put up $35,000 is going to know that they have a glaring problem like that before they put the money up. Little minor things that allow you to correct as you go along. So there is some working with the companies who are trying to certify to make sure they make it over the bar. If you go in there without some major piece that you have to have, you're just wasting your time. But hopefully we're all smart enough not to make that mistake.
Go ahead.
As far as lab interfacing goes, I think you mentioned that you were working with LabCorp, and you working toward, and there are some aspects of electronic laboratory result reporting as part of the meaningful use. What type of support for lab interfaces are you working on today? Is it generic HL7251? Is it some of the standards that are coming out, either the HITSB standard, the C36, or the E-Links standard?
So the question is, what standards are we supporting for the lab interface? And at this point, what we're doing is supporting what LabCorp needs us to support to get through their certification, with the intent that we take we have the basic infrastructure for doing the lab interface infrastructure and lab exchange, and then we add the additional support as we add other lab services and as standards come out. So
Just a heads up, LabCorp is a HL7 2.3 specification. CCHIT certification requires 251 at a base minimum. So something to work into your plan.
Appreciate that, and that's why we like to have these kind of meetings, is get as much feedback on that kind of stuff. There's so many pieces to the certification process that it's easy for details to fall through like that. Go ahead.
Are you guys aware of the NIST EHR testing framework that's being developed at NIST?
Yes. Yeah, we're very aware of that and very, very dependent on that framework in order to QA our process.
If you just go to healthcare.nist.gov, that's a great launching pad.
Yeah.
For even more than just the test scripts.
Yeah.
You're talking about LICA? You're talking about LICA or something different? You guys know about LICA and look at that for your stuff?
We know about LICA. We've been going from, I guess, the answer is we do know about LICA. We haven't been using it as a test tool yet.
No.
Kind of wanted to get the basic stuff written first, based on what we know in terms of what's going to be required in terms of the meaningful use items. And once we think we're in pretty good shape, go back and start doing more QA testing to make sure we're actually going to pass the scripting process. Go ahead, Fred.
So, yeah, I think you can turn on that microphone. Do both microphones work? Yeah. Okay, so you can both talk. Number one.
It's number one. Turn it on when I need it. And you can keep that one.
Okay, so just for the benefit of those here, could you explain what LICA is? So I think everybody knows.
LICA is a project that's actually housed on SourceForge, and my understanding is that the LICA project is a testing engine developed specifically for the purpose of doing this type of testing. At the time of the inception of LICA, it was actually specifically for CCHIT, though with the new testing organizations coming into existence, I would expect LICA would have to expand their horizon and be able to service more than one testing organization. Do you have any additional information, Fred, than that?
I know it's based on the NIST script, so it's supposed to do that stuff. It's actually kind of interesting cloud-based service where they'll spawn off you an instance of your testing environment. It's really, really cool and is not mapped to, is not married to CCHIT. So even though it's sponsored by them, started by them, developed by MITRE, and you can use it to do any certification. And one of the things that I think people have asked me is, do you want Liberty Health Software Foundation, which is one of the organizations that I work with, which is a nonprofit for open source and healthcare, to become a certification body. And the way we look at that is, well, if we could use LICA and make it really cheap, and provide us a solution for Medsphere and everybody else to become automatically, meaningfully use qualified, using an all open source stack and an all open source project. I think we would probably cooperate with CCHIT to do that. That's something we've thought about, which I would love to get your response to.
I am all for using open source tools. I break out into hives when I have to touch one of those other machines. The first thing I do when I buy new computers, I delete the virus.
Another question about modules and customizations. How do those play into the certification? Somebody adds another module that helps osteopaths or some other different view of medicine. Do those have to go through the certification process too? Does a provider adding customizations, at what point do customizations turn into needing certification?
It's an interesting question. If you go back and look at the actual
Repeat
I'm
the
sorry.
question.
Do other modules having to do with non-medical doctor types of practices, which would include osteopathic medicine, chiropractic medicine, dentists, optometrists, physical therapy. We have a lot of different types of users in our project, and we are very easy to modify. We are very open. We take practically any type of healthcare provider and are able to help them do their practice better. We have a guy who wants to do Reiki and use OpenEMR to document his Reiki sessions. If you go back and look at the ARRA of 2009, it's very specific about meaningful use, and that this really only applies to medical doctors. It leaves out lots and lots of groups. It leaves out nurse practitioners. It leaves out dentists. It leaves out everybody. So when it comes to meaningful use, for the federal government, they're very myopic about things. And what they're referring to is if you want to get a 2% increase in your reimbursement for Medicare reimbursement, you need to be able to show that you're doing some form of electronic prescribing, and you have to use a definite procedure code that says that you're using electronic prescribing for that encounter. And then if you want to get your $45,000 worth of tax incentives, then you have to be a medical doctor using a certified product. So what that means is that type of osteopathic module means nothing. It has nothing to do with the law. It has nothing to do with CMS reimbursement, so it doesn't need to be certified.
So a doctor using these things and aiming for the Medicare 2% bump.
If you want to get your 2% increase, you have to be using a certified product, and you have to go through the certification.
You can. There's nothing to prevent you from having extra modules, but you have to have meet the minimum requirements for meaningful use in order to get your care.
And it doesn't necessarily apply because I think you're talking about other practice areas or specialties.
Well, I'm including, we have a lot of fusion medicine there where, they're medical care, they do Medicare, and they also do acupuncture.
Ruling though that it eliminated a lot of specialties or special types of care like homeopathy and stuff like that. They weren't included. Is that correct?
They don't have anything to do with why you would get increased reimbursement from the federal government. So you can have those modules, and they can be part of your project, but they could care less because what they want is for doctors to stop making errors on their prescriptions.
So some modules are going to be related to meaningful use, and some aren't. How is that going to affect your release model for OpenEMR as that relates to the recertification process?
I think that's one of the major issues we have to deal with. The structure of OpenEMR is been around for a long time, and so as a consequence, it's not very modular at this point. And so part of what we have to address as a team is how to make sure that future additions to the product that may have not anything to do with meaningful use or with a particular physician-specific practice don't break the things that are meaningful use categories. That's not as difficult as it sounds in the product because most of the meaningful use activities that have been added as new features, and they've been much better modularized, and so they're a little bit more protected from the overall process. It certainly doesn't affect, if an osteopath wants to use OpenEMR and they don't need meaningful use certification, they can do anything they want to with it, and it won't make any difference. And our team, if somebody submits some code back to us that's a modification, is going to be very careful about those code submissions not being in conflict with our certification. And it may be, and fork is a bad word, but it may be that we have to have, and down the road, that we have to have a certification branch of product that's certified and sort of the stable versus the development, the community version versus the certified version. And we may have to do that down the road. We're hoping to not do that. We're hoping to make sure that the certification stuff stays in isolation enough that we can not worry about that.
I think my view of this is OpenEMR is like a basic Christmas tree. Very plain Jane, nothing on it. And then you can start adding Christmas lights and decorations as much as you want. The basic tree is going to be the CCHIT or ONC certified version. And then if you have a module that does homeopathy, it's perfectly fine to add that on. That does not affect meaningful use in any kind of way. The basic program is very well defined what they want. It has mostly to do with reducing errors by doctors and trying to improve the quality of care for CMS, Medicare, and Medicaid recipients. When we start adding on other modules that have to do with homeopathy, Reiki, physical therapy, chiropractic, they don't care. We can add as many of those modules as we want as long as we don't touch the core of what they consider to be meaningful use. The core itself can't be modified except for bug fixes, which I think is one of the concessions they made for the open source projects. Whereas if we had a major feature that could potentially negatively impact how we certified on meaningful use to start with, that part would have to be recertified. Say if we rewrote the entire e-prescribing module, then that's something that they would have to look at and probably recertify. Whereas if we hang on a module that helps a physical therapy do, he's not a doctor. They don't care about that.
So that makes perfect sense conceptually. So that lends itself more towards managing, versioning, and releasing those modules independently of the core.
That's the goal, is to have the core, that's the meaningful use part, and then hang on these modules for people that need that type of functionality.
Curious, are people working on those modules?
Yes, but it's like an open source project. I have a optometrist that lives in my town. He wants me to come get my glasses from him. He's working on an optometry module for OpenEMR. And you get individuals that get this, they get the fire in their heart and they want to fix that piece. And so you let them go for it. And that happens usually in chiropractic, it happens in physical therapy, it's happening in optometry.
Podiatry.
We have a big allergy group up in Massachusetts that wants to have a specialized allergy module that they're working on.
Yeah. Fortunately, that part of OpenEMR's infrastructure is pretty isolated from the core. The core demographics, e-prescribing, prescription modules, the things that touch meaningful use are there. And most of those kinds of things are contained in the forms tools that allow you to do event tracking and visit tracking forms. And those forms are extremely customizable and extremely easy to create in OpenEMR. And in fact, in the currently the way that the source tree is managed, there's a contributors directory. And that contributors directory has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of forms that have been contributed that don't really get the kind of scrutiny that I was describing, the heavy source code scrutiny that the core gets. They pretty much get accepted as is, and they're, use them if you at your own risk kind of forms. But they're in every category across the board, and they overlap each other sometimes. There's probably 10 or 11 different kinds of review of system forms because different people have different workflows, and so they just implement their own forms under those categories. And so part of what we're trying to make sure we're doing going down the road is separate the custom form capabilities from the critical data that it needs to be collected and reported as part of the certification process. And some of that is mixed up in there, and most of it isn't, but some of it is sort of buried in those customizable forms, and that's one of our challenges, is to make sure that we have a pretty clean dividing line there.
Part of what we're going to do is actually take the existing number of forms and trim it down to 5. And those 5 are going to be part of the meaningful use version. We're going to force everybody into using the same set of vital signs so that we can do reporting off of that and be able to certify on that. In the past, we've had 3 or 4 or 5 different kinds of vital sign forms. Everybody had their own little preference. But what we're doing is forcing everybody who wants to have the meaningful use certification, they want that particular version, they have to use that one vital sign form. And we're going to really trim down the number of forms a lot, because otherwise we will not be able to deal with hundreds of forms that are non-standard, and we're not going to be able to certify all those forms. Go ahead.
So one of the things that, is David open the room yet?
Sorry?
Okay, so Clear Health, one of the things that they are throwing off of their Web Vista project is a generalizable and parsable, I think it might be XML, interpretation of all of the Vista forms.
Yeah, we have one of our developers has done that too.
Is that useful to you?
It might be, but we already have an XML generation form. We have a tool that will generate forms from XML formats, so there may be some overlap there, worth looking into. we're about out of time. And,
You were going to ask the question?
No.
he was telling us that we're about out of time.
How about in the back over here?
Given the certification process that you're going through, is there a change in the contribution and review model for things that may affect the core?
I don't think there's so much a change as just some increased scrutiny. We already have a pretty tight asterisk group of contributors who maintain that, who watch that really closely, and so I think we just get more careful as we get closer, and particularly after we're certified, we're even more careful. Yes.
Question about the certification process. Is there any chance of getting government funding for the certification? I know Rockefeller was looking at that at one point.
I spent an hour with, I think his name was David Helms, January 19th of 2008 from 11 a.m. till noon for a solid hour. He said, call us back when you're certified.
Yeah, so at that time,
for an hour,
maybe now it's different.
Over and over.
At that time, getting funding from the government meant you had to be certified first, which was kind of a catch-22.
And then,
so I think we're out of time now.
I know a little
Go
bit
ahead.
about that. It depends what agency you were talking
Yeah,
to.
and that's what we've heard.
I would suggest you talk to the Health Resources Services Administration because they're really interested in open source for smaller facilities that can't afford a big commercial.
Okay.
So the answer is it depends.
Yeah, it always does with the government. So thank you very much for coming. If you want to, there are live demos of OpenEMR up on our website. If you go to oemr.org, there's live demos of essentially every version, including 30 minutes ago development tips. So feel free to go out and play and corner us if you have any questions. And thank you very much.